June 26, 2012 is surely a forgettable date to nearly everyone, but for me, that date over 12 years ago represents the first time I signed up for a beta for a new dark fantasy ARPG titled Path of Exile. Developed by a small team in New Zealand named Grinding Gear Games, it aimed to replicate some aspects of Diablo 2 while creating a community for the ARPG enthusiast. Rare for the time, Grinding Gear Games also marketed the game as entirely free to play, with all revenue deriving solely from cosmetic microtransactions. It was an ambitious plan, and yet, over the nearly dozen years since the official release, GGG has continued to be successful. By developing a deep, complex ARPG that kept players continually engaged with new content, they formed a dedicated community and, by some accounts, the greatest ARPG ever developed. So then, when an integrated sequel was announced at ExileCon in 2019 to be a major expansion for the game, it all made sense. But 4 years later, in 2023, GGG announced it would be a separate game. So what does that mean for the original Path of Exile? Will over a decade's worth of microtransactions be lost? What's changing? I was invited to Los Angeles to meet with some members of the development team, and a discussion with game director Jonathan Rogers, along with several hours of hands-on play of the early access version that will launch on December 6th. Let's get into it. First things first, Path of Exile 2 is a direct sequel and a standalone game. However, GGG has gone through lengths to associate PoE 1 and 2 as much as possible. So, that means the vast majority of microtransactions will be shared across both games. This means that your past purchases will move forward, and nearly anything you buy in the future will work on both games. With the exception, as described by the team, are aspects of specific skills or items that may not exist in both games. Also, the overall look and feel of the two games means the sequel will feel instantly familiar to longtime fans. This is because both games are running on the same engine. This decision was made to ensure as much unity as possible between the two. However, there are some notable improvements in the sequel that become apparent rather quickly. This is due to the continued improvement and evolution of the game engine over the past decade plus. Path of Exile 2 benefits from all of those updates, while areas of the original game haven't been as fortunate. But experienced players will be sure to notice near immediately. In speaking about the story and lore, Rogers is quick to point out that there will be plenty to find in Path of Exile 2 for lore buffs, and they've ensured it all flows together with the original so they won't have to retcon anything down the line. That said, he was also clear that you won't have had to have played the first game to enjoy the second. To immediately interest new players in the world of Rayclast, one of the first things we were shown, and you will experience when you begin, is a full cinematic cutscene. This is a first for the franchise, and Rogers informs us that there are several throughout the game. They had found that, narratively, players engaged more with the story when cinematics were introduced. And after watching the initial cutscene, I can certainly see why. Getting started, Early Access will begin with 6 character classes, including the new Mercenary, Monk, Sorceress, and Warrior classes. Naturally, in my limited time, I decided to focus on 2 of those in the Mercenary and the Monk. The Mercenary features a crossbow as their main weapon, which can then be enhanced with varying status effects as you would expect with other skills. With directional, ranged aiming, and having to reload frequently, playing the Mercenary class reminded me more of a top-down shooter than an ARPG, with GGG also commenting that all classes can now aim with WASD if you prefer. While our time was limited and I certainly want to experiment more in the future, I didn't vibe with the Mercenary out of the gate. Frequently needing to reload for not only your ammo, but also when changing shot types, felt cumbersome at best and clunky at worst. And yes, I fully realize I'm probably going to eat those words in due time. Regardless, I started over after a short period, this time focusing on the Monk. It didn't take me long to feel at home with the Monk, and I spent the rest of my playtime smashing my way through hordes of enemies with my quarterstaff. The Monk focuses on fast, two-handed melee attacks, and when combined with various status effects, quickly becomes a force to be reckoned with. I found the ice skills particularly effective, and in my few hours of play, I never tired of freezing groups of enemies, only to later smash them into cubes. There's a noticeable improvement in the look and feel here from the original, particularly when using a controller. Animations and attacks are more fluid, and movement and item collection is more refined. Noticeable immediately as well is excellent sound design and direction. Weapons hit with emphasized force, and even small effects like the reloading of the crossbow sound clear and detailed. Directionally, PoE 2's sound really impressed me. For instance, there's a mini-boss early on that is crying whom I could hear from screens away ever so faintly when the action was subdued. As I approached from varying angles, the crying blended seamlessly with everything going on around me until it was most prevalent upon my direct approach. Very well done, GGG. Joining the Mercenary, Monk, Sorceress, and Warrior for early access are the Witch and the Ranger. Though, while classes return, some aspects of their play have been evolved. For instance, the Ranger, and all classes for that matter, can now move while shooting, which is a small change that has big impact. Additionally, each of the classes has 2 Ascendancy classes at launch, with an additional one for each class being added for the 1.0 release. These allow you to specialize even further in each class with some absurdly creative skills and abilities. In Path of Exile 2, Ascendancy is achieved by conquering unique trials that you will encounter throughout the campaign. These trials feature upwards of 70 rooms across up to 4 floors, all with randomized enemies and layouts. Most importantly, the 6 classes at Early Access launch are only the beginning, with GGG confirming 6 more classes are to be delivered in, quote, relatively quick order after launch. Skill design has undergone several changes in Path of Exile 2, even though the foundation will feel familiar to returning players. The biggest change you'll notice immediately is that items no longer have sockets for skill gems. Rather, skill gems are still found and evolved like loot, but they are managed via a skill table instead. To me, this is a massive quality of life update, as not having to worry about socket drops on items, linking, socket orb hunting, etc. is a very positive change. Each class has its own skills that can be activated and leveled as you find skill gems throughout your play, and certain skills require higher level skill gems to activate. It's up to you when finding a new gem if you want to level your current skills or activate new ones. While our time was limited, it's a system that felt more intuitive and certainly less cumbersome than in the original. Supplementing your normal skill gems are new Spirit Gems, which utilize a resource named Spirit. These can provide additional bonuses and add-on effects to your existing skills while combining with one another to enhance your attacks. Each skill can be supplemented with up to 5 Spirit Gems, and they can be moved around at will. Additionally, while the game recommends certain Spirit Gems for skills, they are not locked, meaning there's a dizzying number of potential combinations. According to Grinding Gear Games, not only can these become very powerful, but there are so many possible combinations that they haven't even fully experimented with them yet. It's going to be amazing seeing what the community pieces together in time. Perhaps the most well-known aspect of Path of Exile is the passive tree. Each time you level up, you will receive a point to spend on the passive tree to further enhance your abilities. Path of Exile 2, the tree contains a mind-boggling 1,500 nodes, with all 12 classes eventually being represented and interconnected. Each class begins at a unique point on the tree and surrounded by the most notable skill buffs for that specific class. But the player has complete freedom in how they progress, including the capability to unlock bonuses typically aligned with other classes. Throughout the passive tree, players can find larger nodes labeled Notables, which provide significant bonuses and enhancements. Even larger and more unique, Keystones provide build-changing aspects but often come with a compromise. These are for players who want to truly experiment with unique builds. Jewels also return, which can be socketed at points in the tree to gain even more positive effects. A very welcome addition to Path of Exile 2 is the ability to assign passive nodes to 2 different skill or item sets simultaneously. This means you can swap attacks in real time, and your associated passive skills will swap with you. For example, if you're a sorceress and swapping between fire and ice skills, you will be able to enhance both at the same time in the passive tree. Seeing all the skill combinations demonstrated for us is truly astounding. PoE already raised the bar in this regard, and with the addition of spirit skills, new ascendancies, and new item affixes, I can only imagine how wild players in Path of Exile 2 will eventually become. Itemization in the sequel is quite similar to the original. Items come in common, magic, rare, or unique varieties, and you can use orbs and vendors to continually improve them. The most welcome change, though, is that orbs that are used to modify items are far more common than in the original and will drop regularly. Additionally, you can acquire orbs in different ways now, including selling items, scrapping items, and simply buying them with gold. In that vein, buying and selling items is much more aligned with other games in the genre, as PoE 2 now features a normal gold currency that you acquire as you play. And lastly, even though skill socketing is gone on items, you can still find items with sockets or add sockets to them in a more traditional sense to merely enhance their abilities further. Just like in the original, unique items are very rare but feature build-impacting abilities. Rogers has also confirmed that every unique in the game, of which there are hundreds, has been updated with unique graphics in the updated engine. Their design focus for uniques is to function as, quote, build enablers, which will take players down new paths on the passive tree to build and customize in new ways. A new item named Charms can now be equipped as well as a function of your belt. Up to 3 can be equipped at once, depending on your belt. They are used to provide further bonuses and/or resistances after using flasks. The charm meter fills as you use your flasks, and as I seem to be saying endlessly, you can customize these to supplement your build further. And yes, flasks too have changed. While in the original, you were equipping up to 8 flasks and, as Rogers describes, playing musical flasks, with the sequel, they're simply enabling 1 flask for health and 1 for mana. You will still find flasks of varying sizes and bonuses, but you won't be smashing keys endlessly to refill your pools. Overall, even in my short time, I found that I spent far more time improving gear rather than hoping for a certain socket type to drop, which in and of itself is a big improvement of the original. It feels as though GGG managed to sand the rough edges off while maintaining and even adding functionality. That's a tough line to walk, but from what I've seen and played so far, they've managed it. Most striking upon setting out in the sequel are the environments. Even in my short time playing through the early parts of Act 2, environmental diversity was a large step up from the original game. And it's not merely the diversity or variety, but the environmental detail. With improved animations, foliage density, and enhanced lighting and sound, Path of Exile 2 feels far more alive than its predecessor. In speaking with Rogers, each act has a theme that is inspired by different cultures. Obviously, with GGG being based in New Zealand, Islander culture comes into play, alongside influences from many cultures around the world. This certainly comes through in the footage we've seen, but I can't wait to see what the whole picture looks like in the 1.0 release. Similar to the original, the game is broken up into acts, and you will progress through the region while encountering small side stories, boss battles, and hidden areas along the way. As with many other aspects, this is a little more intuitive in the sequel. The map highlights the paths to each region, but also shows you where you can expect various boss types and special skill enhancements to hunt down. For instance, should you conquer a specific major boss in each act, you can earn permanent stat boosts or additional passive skill tree points. My journey through Act 1 featured a very strong mix of environments and enemy types, but what I really enjoyed is that it felt more connected narratively than in Path of Exile 1. I felt more invested in what I was doing, and the layout and structure also felt more familiar in the gaming sense. It's a difficult thing to describe, but it simply feels like a more well-organized game. When combined with the refined map, hunting down boss battles and upgrades, and exploring the environments, I found myself fully sucked into the world so completely that I didn't even want to take a break to eat. Probably the most notable information shared with us is that earlier this year, the development team completely changed their focus and priority. Less than a year prior to release, that would typically be cause for alarm. Fortunately, in this case, it has resulted in what I believe to be the best decision Grinding Gear Games has made. Path of Exile 2's full release will feature a 6-act campaign, which should provide players around 50 hours worth of content. While the original plan was to provide players access to the full campaign in early access, and then build out the endgame from there, the team recognized that most players will spend hundreds or even thousands of hours in endgame, while the campaign merely becomes a means to an end eventually. With that in mind, early access will feature 3 acts, which will provide about 25 hours of campaign content. After completing the 3 acts the first time, you will then play a new version of the first 3 acts again, labeled Cruel Mode, which is kind of reminiscent in ways of a New Game Plus. There will be new bonuses and some changes on the Cruel playthrough, but Acts 4 through 6 will launch now with the game on its 1.0 release. Playing through in this way should level you to approximately level 65, which is where the end game begins, with max level being 100. With the priority shift, GGG has focused their efforts on building out a much more substantial endgame that is ready immediately for early access launch. I'll provide a high-level overview, but to be clear, the endgame features and content are extensive. I highly recommend watching the full gameplay presentation from GGG to give you the full details, particularly if you're new to Path of Exile. The endgame begins with the Atlas, an infinitely expanding map full of nodes that each represent a type of content to consume. Each of the nodes has a randomly generated levels and enemies, and as the map expands, it will feature a mix of endgame content to conquer, special engagements, and even monolith towers featuring pinnacle bosses. Pulling over and evolving some of the league content from PoE 1, there are 8 different tree and event types of endgame progression that will be available at launch and early access. A few examples include expeditions, in which you plant bombs across an area to discover chests, caverns, and areas to combat enemies, and rituals, in which you earn tribute to spend on items and continuously increase the enemy challenge. Working through the map means an endless string of progression across not only your core character and skills, but the 8 unique endgame trees and near endless item optimization. Additionally, certain unique items can only be acquired at some of the later areas of the endgame. At early access launch, PoE 2 will feature 50 bosses and over 400 enemy types. While this will expand to 100 bosses and over 800 enemy types with the 1.0 release, even in early access there's a great deal of enemy and boss variety in your encounters. With several unique activities, an endlessly expanding activity map, and deep randomization, there will be an awful lot to consume even on day one. There are some additional aspects worth calling out in the sequel as well. Players will likely be happy to learn that there are no trading restrictions on any items. While gold is locked to your character, all other items can be freely traded with other players. There is also a new currency exchange feature in which you can offer trades with players globally. If you're looking for specific items, orbs, or just to earn some gold, you can put out an offer out publicly for players to review and accept. From a playability perspective, Grinding Gear Games is enabling players to form community and control their own experience, which I certainly applaud. The sequel also supports up to 6-player co-op multiplayer, including local on-screen co-op, and cross-progression, and cross-play. GGG have done a tremendous job in aiming to support both new and returning players alike in this vein. As someone with thousands upon thousands of hours in ARPGs, I'm extremely excited for Path of Exile 2. Even in early access, it features hundreds of hours worth of content and unique aspects in the genre. I cannot wait to dive in fully without time restrictions. Early access launches on December 6th on PC, Xbox Series X and S, and PlayStation 5. They will also be supporting enhancements for the PS5 Pro for those interested. The core supporter pack to get early access is $30 but there are other packages available as well, which you can find on their supporter page on the site. For now, I leave you with this footage and stay tuned for our full review coming in the near future. And as always, thank you for supporting independent gaming journalism at Season Gaming.